I'm Dan Kimbrough, and this is Systemic, a podcast about race. I'm a diversity and inclusion advocate and trainer, educator, trained conflict mediator, and media producer with over 20 years of community building and diversity experience. From local communities to university campuses to corporate trainings, I've used my voice to bring people together and better understand each other. I'm also a Black man and father. Each episode of Systemic will explore new aspects of race and racism in America. We will look at where we've been, how we got here, how it affects us today, and how we can move forward. The aim is to educate and explain the intertwining of race as a systemic part of American history and culture. We hope that each episode enlightens and drives you to help work towards an anti-racist future. Welcome back to Systemic. This is Dan Kimbrough, and today we are joined by Joshua Brockway. Josh and I go way back. Someone else from Manchester College. Josh is currently the Director of Spirituality for the Church of the Brethren nationally. Also teaches history at Northern Seminary. Is that right?
That's correct.
Yep. Adjunct. So Josh and I are going to have a conversation today looking at Christianity and systemic racism and sort of how Christianity has propped up systemic racism here in America, but overall looking at multiple different races, but also what's being done from his view to sort of dismantle it. So one of the things that you sent me, Josh, to read talked about the idea that from a very early standpoint, Christianity has sort of found a way of centering itself at most things and creating others out of everyone else. And I think that really ties into this notion of white supremacy and systemic racism, in that Christianity has become sort of the standpoint of, a white religion, but really Christians were Gentiles. They weren't the actual original Christians, depending on when you put that title on. So could you talk about racism and systemic racism and sort of how a white-centered view of Christianity has sort of hurt groups in the past?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's an amazing question. I mean, just to give props to Dr. Willie James Jennings, who's at Yale, and his book, The Christian Imagination, which, documents all of this all the way through. And he does it through a particular methodology, but it's a helpful one to see the connections, especially coming out of Europe, right at the same time as Europe is expanding into the Western Hemisphere, right? As colonialism is taking shape. If you look at that, and the thing that struck me was him saying, like, look, the same time Columbus is setting sail, right, Jews are being expelled from Spain. So in the very same year, 1492, Jews are expelled from Spain, which was a Christian kingdom, right? And so then he says, there's always this question about if people converted or not, right? If they really became Christian, and the only way that they could begin to determine that, or even take a guess, right, was skin color, whether that's North African Muslims in the Spanish kingdom or Jewish kingdom members, right? Like they begin to link skin color to Christianity in a way as an other right there. Now, at the same time that's happening, right, like the whole Western Hemisphere expands, right? So you start to find a whole nother range of people groups that don't look European, right? Mm-hmm. They're not white. They're not white skinned, or maybe dark hair, right? Like, so all of these things start to link skin tone, ethics, their ability to act in certain ways, and also their belief systems. For centuries then, Christianity starts to, quote unquote, scientifically link all of these things together with skin tone, right? I mean, basically making a hierarchy of, at the peak of this hierarchy is white Europeans, and you keep moving down. You might have Asians who are, really smart still, or have a strong work ethic, but they're still not quite there. And then you have Native Americans, and then you have Africans, and they're at the bottom of the list, right? The darker the skin, the least appreciated, the least valued. The only thing they're good for is basically enslavement at that point.
Right. And I know one of the things when we look back at some of the early slave code and slave laws, early on, if someone who was enslaved was brought over from a country that was deemed Christian, there was the opportunity for freedom. And then eventually that goes away. And at one point, if you could find a way of baptizing the enslaved individuals, whether they were Native American or they were African, that was a way to freedom. But then that goes away as well. And so there's almost this direct link with looking at early American laws and slave laws and Christianity, and this notion of how do we really start eliminating all others, so that here in America, if you were Christian, you were white, and if you were free, you were white. And so it's almost like freedom and Christianity become linked together at some point.
Yeah, completely. Right. Like, so in England at that point, if you were to baptize someone, you couldn't hold them as a slave anymore. Right. So it doesn't take long until in the Virginia colony, they come along and they're like, no, this is not economically beneficial for us, because they wrestle. I mean, they do fight about, they do argue about in the literature. What do you do with these quote unquote heathens, right? Like, they're still, even if they're Christian, they're coming from African places where Christianity has existed back to the 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th century.
Mm-hmm.
Even if they're Christian, they still aren't the right Christian, which means my thing, right? My white thing.
Mm-hmm.
And then they
Well,
say
that's an
this isn't
interesting
economic. Yeah,
Oh,
right.
go ahead.
They start to say then, well, this isn't economically beneficial, right? So if I baptize them, which is part of what I'm supposed to do in the Christian life, I lose their labor and their economic benefit to me. So really what we're going to say is, if you're black, you're enslaved, right? It doesn't matter what we do, whether that's we teach you the Bible or we baptize you. Enslavement becomes linked then to being black.
Mm-hmm. Which mentioned the whole idea that, what we're supposed to do as Christians is baptize individuals. And it seems like it's almost, there must have been some sort of struggle. If the idea of missionary work and if you're a good Christian, part of it is prophesizing and trying to convert people to Christianity. But then you have this brick wall that says, well, no, economically for the country to move forward, we can't be, quote unquote, good Christians and do this. And so I know it's a John Wolfe I'm thinking of, who was an abolitionist who wrote a book called, On the Keeping of Negroes, where he literally this was the entire book, was this notion of how does one call themselves a Christian while owning another individual and refusing, the right of baptism to somebody for the pure notion of economical gain. And so there's probably not a single point or a single issue where this happened, but how is it then that when we look at a lot of African Americans who come out of slavery and out of that, antebellum era, how is it that it becomes linked, that all these Africans who eventually become black and African Americans are so tied to Christianity, when Christianity, we could see from early on, has been built around this idea of keeping them down?
Mm-hmm. Sure. There's some theologians, right, that say one of the greatest examples of God's goodness is the black church, the existence of the black church.
Wow.
That the idea is to say, like, they still find within the scriptures, in particularly, when they are taught to read, especially by some Methodist ministers and some Baptists, some Quaker, they are taught to read and they start to engage the scriptures. They really do find the story of liberation, right, from Moses on, and they start to read it through that lens, and it becomes a source of not just comfort, but it's also challenge. It's giving them a vision beyond the current place. James Cone is amazing as he talks about this stuff in God of the Oppressed and Crossing the Lynching Tree, where he's saying, like, they looked at Jesus on the cross and saw someone who identified with their current suffering, right? And understood that God's salvation, in kind of typical theological language, is something that includes your actual physical, political, and economic liberation. And the fact that stays a part of the black church through antebellum, through Reconstruction, into Jim Crow, is one of those things that we look at and say, this is another form of Christianity that took the Bible pretty seriously in its own context and understood it completely differently from the dominant white frameworks coming out of Europe at that point.
which is really interesting. 'Cause I know, there's a lot of people who will argue, theologians and non-theologians will argue, one of Christianity's easiest way of conversion is that it's a religion for those who are suffering, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's a religion of sufferers, and that it's only through that suffering that you will find salvation. And that early on, like the Bible is flipped in its sort of hierarchy, that the Bible speaks to the notion of the meek shall inherit the earth. But when we look at practice of most Christians throughout history, Christianity is built on the idea that no, while the meek may inherit the earth in the book, in practice, those who are looking to inherit the earth in gains and financial means are those who have, not those who have not. So it's this weird sort of dichotomy that flips back and forth, that the book preaches one thing, but in practice we're learning something else or seeing something else.
Right. There's a strong, and this is starting to move towards your second question, right? Like what's being undone in regards particularly to white supremacy and Christianity is to say, you actually need to find people who are reading it from the margins, reading it, meaning the scriptures, that aren't reading it from a position of power and privilege in a way that kind of corrupts or maintains a current status quo, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, those things, you go to the gospel in Luke and it's pretty clear, right? Like, blessed are the poor now, right? Like these things are all current existential
Yeah.
moments, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so a lot of persons, I mean, good colleagues of mine, great friends, I can name drop them if you want, that really say, look, if you're really serious about trying to understand scripture in a way that isn't connected to the dominant U.S. narrative that we've seen in the last 4 or 5 years take really strong hold again,
Mm-hmm.
um, you gotta like go and listen to the preachers from the Black church or the Hispanic church, Native American leaders, right? That give you a sense of the scripture from the place when it was written, right? Written by a people
Okay.
at the margins of the dominant empire.
That's an interesting thing. I like that. That's an interesting thing, and so how much, in looking at the past 4 or 5 years and that tragedy,
Mm-hmm.
but how much pushback is there, or how much willingness is there to hear from the margins? And I know Jenkins talked about that as well, is that, if we're going to move forward, it's not at a white centered church, but looking at, who's on the margins and what are they saying and how are they preaching. And I like that you say that it ties back into that's sort of where it came from in the beginning, right?
Mm-hmm.
Christianity comes from those who were on the margins. And so to get full circle, we have to go back to that. But is there pushback? How much willingness is there for that to really happen?
That's a really, it's amazing. There's actually a book, and I haven't finished it, so I don't want to give you the whole summary, called White Rage. And it documents these kind of consistent white pushbacks whenever some sort of advancement for those at the margins, particularly Black Americans, comes along, right? So you think Reconstruction, and then you have just the reassertion through Jim Crow, then you have the civil rights movement, then you kind of circle back into the Reagan Democrats, the Southern strategy. You talk about then Barack Obama becoming president, and then there's another cycle of that backlash, right? We can
Right.
see
Right.
this cycle of advancement backlash for centuries.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so it's a reality. Now in the church, I can tell you, when you start in a white dominated church, when you start using language of white supremacy, it makes white folks horribly uncomfortable. I mean, it just unsettles everything about them, because, and I can't think of who is saying this, but I'm putting it in my own words, is to say, if there's one thing that a white person does not want to be called in their life, that's racist.
Right.
Right? Because their images of racists are wearing white hoods, riding horses, physically lynching people, burning crosses, right? That's the image of racist. While our understanding of what racism is has just expanded to understand the cultural formation, the socialization into a system of white supremacy, the dominance of white culture. Um, all of that kind of stuff. So you start to name that, and I'm telling you from experience, like white folks, white pastors just can't handle that accusation, right? Because it's all about intention. Well, I didn't mean to be. I wasn't intending to be racist. It's like, no, I didn't say you were intending to be racist. And I'm not challenging your intentions. I'm telling you, or trying to reveal to you, where your actions are making a racist impact,
Right.
right? Or have
I think it's,
an impact in racism.
yeah, I know one place that I've read that analogy is Robin DiAngelo's White Fragility.
Mm-hmm.
Is one of those places where, that's what one of those, that pushback is, well, you can't call me a racist. I'm not being racist. That's the one big fear. And in a lot of the DEI work, it's interesting that I start with trying to dismantle that notion. I'm like, well, we're talking about white supremacy as a system. So I'm not calling you a racist. Your actions may have been rooted in racism, and the end effect of your actions may have been racist, but that doesn't make you a racist. That's a choice that you have to make on your own. And that's one of the ways that I've found to enter into that conversation. But even that, there's always this pushback. I had someone actually say to me, well, maybe we're just framing it wrong, right? Maybe the PR on white supremacy is wrong. Maybe we shouldn't be calling it white supremacy. And I'm just like, well, what do you want to call it? Like, that's what it is. Like,
Right.
I could call it something else, but then I'm putting your feelings about white supremacy over the fact that it's white supremacy. And so I definitely have seen that pushback in presentations and trainings that I've done. But I think it's also valid, when you're talking, if there's a white pastor talking to their predominantly white congregation, that's a whole level of training to be able to diffuse that and be like,
That's right.
look, you're right. Like, it's not your intentions to be racist, or even our church's intention to have done something racist, but we have. And so, in looking at that, if you get past that, what are some other things that are happening? I know one of the things you said, I know you said you hadn't finished it, but was the one that was talking about, peacemaking and peacemakers, and the idea of how do you show compassion to those who don't fully get it yet, while still sort of holding their feet to the fire.
Yeah. Yeah. No, oh man, that's, what I mean, this is, you and I both know this, but I'll just say it for those that are checking in, is the Church of the Brethren considers itself a peace church, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think one of the things about that is that we haven't quite wrestled with the fact that our idea of peace is framed by dominant white culture, right? It
Mm-hmm.
has certain
Mm-hmm.
assumptions about what that looks like. I mean, this is what happens to King all the time, where, like, he's the one causing violence. What? No. It's like it's like that TikTok meme, like, no, dummy. He's not
Right.
causing the violence. His nonviolence and presence is revealing how violence maintains this current status quo, that maintains a racialized hierarchy. Um, and he's actually receiving the physical blows, the physical violence, right? We have documented evidence in our archives of, after King's death, the number of brethren writers or pastors or leaders, laypersons, just railed against King because of that idea, right? Like, his form of disobedience and social change caused violence.
Right.
It is such a hard task, and I can't say how you do it. I mean, I think that there are some. I mean, the first thing that I would say is that we don't expect sisters and brothers of color to be the ones that have to walk someone through that, right? Uh, that becomes an extraordinarily traumatizing experience, right? Like, we continue to ask, especially Black leaders, well, come teach us about, teach us about what white supremacy is and what racism is doing, and then take our crap when we throw it back at you, right? Like, that's a horribly traumatic experience. And so I think the first step is that the white leaders taking a lead and being able to talk about it in much more, I don't want to even say comfortable, but right, like, not being fearful of the conversation about race.
Right.
I taught a class here right when we went into quarantine for basically they're all pastoral leaders, church leaders on the South Side. So they're predominantly, the whole class was Black students. And they were like, Doc, how do you keep having this conversation and not freak out? I'm like, well, part of it is I can disassociate and talk about it historically, but I have to recognize that, there are pieces of me, theologically, we talk about the fall as this thing that says, nope, I'm impacted by how things are falling apart. And I unwittingly pick those up. So part of my transformation or my discipleship is to undo those things. So I'm here to hear you and what your experiences are, 2020 in Chicago and some of the unrest related to policing and such in the early, what is that, April, May, June of 2020.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So I'm not sure I'm actually answering your question, but I think that there's work to do that, and there's perseverance, right? Like there's some sense for me in having these conversations is to speak truthfully and plainly without taking offense constantly, right?
Right.
But I do have those conversations with pastors, especially after Kenosha, after George Floyd. There was this really striking moment where a number of pastors reached out and said, something is wrong here. I mean, I'm talking about white pastors. Something's wrong here. I'm like, oh, you're just figuring that out. Let's talk. Let's talk. Let's do this. I love this opportunity and have those conversations. But it's a long, long slog to stay connected to those persons so that they can continue to have that kind of transformation, their eyes open to what's happening, and also their eyes open to how white Christianity has framed itself as so objective that it doesn't exist in its own socialized framework. And by socialized, right, like I am trained to see the world in a certain way as a white person in the U.S. And so it's constantly digging at that stuff, I mean, and it's often two steps forward, two steps back, two steps forward,
Right.
one step back, right? Like that just stays there.
Yeah, to the same advancement and setback cycle that you were talking about.
Mm-hmm.
And this is I know the answer. I know your answer. Well, I know your initial answer. I don't know how you'll explain it, but is the church's job to deal with this, right? Like, is this one of those things that, if we don't say the church is white centered, we know it is, but it's not. Let's say we're not. Is church the place, or in preaching the gospel and talking about the life of Christ and all these things? Is this the place where race should be taught? Should it be in the pulpit or the Bible studies or things like? Is this it, or is this not the church's work?
Oh, I think 100% is. I mean, that's where you said the answer to the question.
I know the answer to the original question.
I think 100% it is, right? Like, I would say one of the issues, even since 54 and 55, man, is that the white church hasn't had a truthful conversation about race, white supremacy, and its functions. Right now, we can point to all of these places. It's a book called Divided by Faith, where the sociologists talk about these movements. Dr. Shaniqua Walker Barnes kind of rehearses some of that and says, look, we got Promise Keepers that tried to work on reconciliation, race reconciliation. And it was a really cool symbol for a while, but when they started really working at it, the movement dies. Or we have John Perkins from Jackson, Mississippi, working with Wayne Gordon, who's a colleague of mine up here, and we have these really great interpersonal stories. But to maintain that systemic undoing, to have a truthful conversation, takes a whole lot more people than just one or two. And it means pastors, I think, actually naming these realities from the pulpit, around Bible studies, just kind of consistently digging at it, like I said. And I know some great friends that are doing that work. Most notably, and I don't know why. No, I think the book was on there that I sent you the list. Drew Hart's book, The Trouble I've Seen,
Yes, yeah, that was on there.
Is one of those books that starts to name it in a way. At least we've seen it in Mennonite and Church of the Brethren context of really introducing a lot of the things that we would say are about the realities of race, right? Like using the language first of racialized hierarchy, right? Like, and Drew was amazing. We were having lunch. He goes, well, in my class, by the time we get to that, I go, well, what is this? And then someone says, well, white supremacy. Yep. Right. Like it is a racialized hierarchy, but what's the nature of that racialized hierarchy? It's white supremacy.
Right.
Right. So like
Right.
ways of stepping into that, that do that. But I come back to what my friend Dominique Gilliard says. He works for the Evangelical Covenant Church, that we are discipled into race. And so we actually have to reform or transform in the biblical language ourselves out of the socialization into race. And that means that in a number of ways, like for me, like there's a personal work of having 3 or 4 pastors, leaders of color who I go to and say, help me understand what's going on here. Like, am I reading this situation right? Right. Like in what Drew and some others say is that there's a sense that I, as a white guy, have to submit to leaders, especially women leaders of color, to help understand a lot of those realities. And that's my personal work. That's not my professional work. But that really does enable me to go into a congregation and kind of receive the blows of that white backlash, and say, no, look, you're stuck with me. Like I did tell a pastor who was really frustrated with me at one point. I said, look, this is the middle of COVID. I said, I have my vaccine. I'll drive down. I'll spend 2 weeks there. We'll do breakfast around the neighborhoods, talking to people. I'll, have Bible studies once, every night for 2 weeks, and we'll talk about this stuff. Like I'm ready to have this conversation, but I have to do a lot of personal work along the way to get ready for that.
Right.
And that really is submission to persons of color and leaders of color.
Yeah. Well, and I think that's an interesting notion, and looking at biblically in Christianity, right? Submission is one of those big things. Top tier thing, you've got to be able to submit before you can sort of move yourself forward. And so it's interesting that you say that, one way that white pastors can do that is submitting themselves to those who are different to sort of learn and hear outside of their sort of normal sphere. And so I guess based on that, looking at that, do you think that there is a way to decenter whiteness in the church? Like not talking about the methods of how we're doing it, but do you think, and maybe not our lifetime or next generation's lifetime, but do you think that there's a way of decentering that whiteness and sort of decentering anyness, right? So that it's really about the church and teachings, and it's not about some group being at the center or being a victim or being an oppressor or sort of whatever, like just removing all of that. Do you think that's a possibility in today's version of the church, or does it have to be a complete transformation, as you say?
Well, I do think there's a lot of upending, right? You want to talk about throwing the tables around. I think of places that are really trying to do this. There's a community here, a congregation in Bronzeville on the south side, that, not your south side, Chicago south side, that are working on this, where and really part of this is that, and is doing it in a way that continues to put leaders of color at the very front of the church all the time. Right. And I know this church in Bronzeville, like it does have a white pastor, but he's amazing at like bringing in other voices, making sure that the voice at the pulpit isn't always the white guy. There's a woman that wrote a book in the late 90s, and it was really critiquing the like multicultural or intercultural movement in churches. We were in college when that was kind of hitting the college scene too, right? Like if we could just have a multiculturalism project, we can start to solve some of these issues. Well, she comes back and says, look, as soon as a quote unquote multicultural congregation hits, like, and it's not even the 50% mark, but like 30-70, 30% non-white, 70% white, the white folks start leaving. Right. And that's both in terms of like the makeup of the congregation around them, but also who they are seeing at the front of the church all the time in terms of leadership and interpreting the scriptures, setting the direction, the need to name what the church is doing. That white folks, as soon as they are not in the dominant position by numbers or voice, start to leave and find another place.
That's
So I think it
interesting.
can
That's
happen.
crazy.
And I think we continue to and I'm saying we as a white guy, we continue to undermine that every time, right? Like we have great ambitions, but we get super uncomfortable when other persons start to name both our theology and what our ethics should be in the dominant culture.
That's interesting. That's very, and it's, for me specifically, when I was active in church, back in Fort Wayne, Indiana, at a Lutheran church. The Lutheran church was on the south side, which is a whole other topic. But we were on the south side of town, and the southeast quadrant, which is 80% black, and everyone else is just sort of an older white person who hasn't moved out of the south side yet. But when you walked into my church, it was 98% white. And, my family was pretty much the 2%. No fair. There was Chuck, one other person. But it was small enough that I can literally name the amount of persons of color that were there. And it was one of those weird things that this is a church, and the church has since been sold, financial issues, things that happen in church. And now it is a black church. And so, my church and that congregation moved elsewhere, across town, but the physical church was still there, and it was bought by a different denomination, and now it's a black church. And the community attends. And one of the things when I was there still, towards the end, when they finally sort of numbers started to plummet and they started to lose money, was when they were trying to bring the local community into the building. And so we had an afternoon service that was much more praise and worship based and not the traditional Lutheran church. And people stopped coming to church. They went to other Lutheran churches in the area. Money starts to seep out, and eventually they lose the church. And now that you say that, it's one of those, their whole goal was to try to become multicultural to survive and bring in the local community. And that may have been the linchpin. That is how they lost the church overall.
Yeah, I think
That's
if
crazy.
we come back theologically and say one of the greatest aspects of the gospel, if we want to use that language, is that it's always enculturated. It's always embedded within a culture. I mean, the very idea of God becoming flesh, right, in this Advent Christmas season, that's the focal point. If God comes in the flesh, it means that it's always expressed in some sort of cultural medium.
Right.
Right. Now, sometimes it means that cultural medium can fundamentally corrupt the core nature of the gospel. At other times, it means that it doesn't matter what kind of music you play, right? Whether that's, if you got a drum set. I mean, I went to a friend's ordination a couple of weeks ago, and man, it was a small building, and that drum set was thumping. It was loud. And, that you can do that stuff, or you can have the organ, right?
Mm-hmm.
Maybe sometimes maybe you have a nice Hammond. I know a guy that's an amazing Hammond player for the black choir at Emory when I was there. Oh, fantastic, right? Like you have all of this range, and it's not the cultural medium, although especially white persons begin to see their framework. I mean, this is going back to Du Bois, right? Like I see the world in one frame where you see the world through two frames, right? Like there's
Right.
your, and I'm using you specifically, right? Like as a black man, you see it in two ways. You know how to exist in the white spaces and in your own cultural medium. For me as a white guy, it takes a lot to begin to see that there are two ways of looking at the world that way. And I just assume my cultural preferences are the normative for everybody else.
Right.
And so when all of a sudden somebody brings in the drum set and the Hammond, I feel like I'm not hearing the gospel anymore. And that's just, it's such a
crazy.
struggle. Yeah, it's crazy. It's really kind of insane, right? Like this is how deeply embedded kind of the white assumption of the view from nowhere is in American Christianity.
That's crazy. Yeah. And it's right. And you're right. And I think even at this time of year, if you put on, if you're, we're going to put on some Christmas music, I'm going to get real suspect of what you're putting on, because if there's no Temptations, it's not Christmas music to me, Like, I didn't grow up listening to Bing Crosby, So, well, I mean, I did whenever I left my house,
When you
because
were
that's the
someone
white
in a White
frame,
House.
right? Like that's the white frame. But for me in a black house, we listened to the Jackson Five and the Berry Gordy Motown Christmas. That was Christmas, So you're right. There's that whole two frames, using that one example. So looking at the church, then how much influence should the outside world, right? A lot of this we're talking about is cultural difference.
Mm-hmm.
How much influence should the outside world have in helping the church move through this? Because I feel like in the past, it's always been these two different silos, right? Well, we're going to do this and this is how the church is going to move forward and society is doing this, but should there be some intermingling? And not saying that, you need to bring in atheists or agnostics, but just how much should the outside world have an influence on how the church is moving through this idea of racism?
Well, I mean, a good example of how this, and we come back to the backlash again, right, is as soon as those folks started having conversations or reaching out after George Floyd and Kenosha, very quickly the rhetoric about critical race theory entered our churches, or the rhetoric against critical race theory.
Yeah, right.
Right, which as a historian, that drives me insane. Right, it absolutely drives me insane. Like, you don't know what you're
Well, and
talking
look,
about.
as someone who works in DEI, my biggest thing I keep telling people, I'm like, it's a legal framework. Unless you were in law school,
You have
looking,
never learned it.
you've never learned it. No one's ever taught it to you. Unless your child is somehow enrolled in a pre-K law program, like, they are not learning critical race theory. So I get, from you as a historian, like, it's just one of those. I'm like, you realize that you've created an issue that does not exist.
Oh yeah, but this is historically that's what white people do, right?
Right.
This is a Scope Monkeys trial. This is about fundamentalism all the way through race. That's what we do.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the question of critical race theory is one of those things of how is the wider conversation of race entering into the Christian discourse about race. Now, it may not necessarily actually be critical race, but it's saying who informs the conversation and who sets the terms. There's a guy out here, he teaches at Wheaton, his name's Esau McCulley, and he has a great book called Reading the Bible While Black. But he also did this kind of series of tweets, and it might have been in Christianity Today, where he was like, this is my paraphrase, that Dr. McCulley is way more eloquent than I am about this. He's like, all y'all white guys are freaking out about social justice and this conversation about race, but we've been talking about this in the black church forever. Yeah. Right? Like, in some ways, like, I would say, we don't actually have to go to Ibram Kendi, who is a fantastic writer, or any of these, the 1619 Project. We don't have to go to these wider popular conversations, because the black church has been having this conversation about what it means to be in a white dominant culture.
Right.
Since 1619, right? Like, go there and hear how they're talking about it. They don't separate the wider movements of justice from the internal conversion, right? Like, they don't set up this binary of individual faith and dominant culture, right? Like, they just go listen, go listen to a preacher, right? So in one hand, I'm saying it doesn't have to be a conversation about the wider church or having those involved, although it does help. I did help kind of facilitate a diversity to inclusion workshop for the church. We did it all online, and the woman that did the DEI work for it, she would name herself as atheist, I think, and then part of that's just seeing how horrible the church has been. But it's not that she doesn't understand it. But it was really helpful because she's coming into this setting not being invested in the institutional structure in a way that the white folks are. And so she can say some things and not feel like she's losing her soul in the midst of saying it. Right.
Gotcha. Nope. I get that.
So there is a benefit of having a wider conversation about what race and the realities of race are doing in our culture.
Mm-hmm. But not necessarily needed if you just go to those who are in the culture who are already having the conversation.
Oh yeah, 100%. Or have had the conversation for generations, right? And
Right,
that's,
right.
um, or hand him to Boy, right? Or hand him Ida B. Wells, right? And then say, okay,
Yeah,
tell me
yeah,
that George Floyd wasn't a lynching.
exactly, right. Here's some
Um,
bell hooks. Read this for a little while.
oh, well, yeah, I would love to be able to handle church bell hooks. Um,
Yeah, it'd be a short-lived tenure for you then.
that's all right. I'll take it. It'd be worth it. I'd die on that hill. So here outside Chicago in Elgin, where I live, I didn't do it intentionally at the beginning, right? The council called together a task force on policing, on kind of re-envisioning policing,
Mm-hmm.
and I kind of commend him for it. And then I was like, that would be amazing to be a part of. But I'm like, the last thing that they need in this task force is another white guy, right? So I didn't
Right,
apply the
right.
first time around. Well, then they did the second call for applicants. I'm like, all right, I'll at least put it in. And, of course, then I get named to it, right?
Of course.
And in the first meeting, I said, but dude, I'm the only white guy, which is great, right? Like,
Mm-hmm.
it is fundamentally great when you think about the makeup of 18 people on this committee. And finally,
Right.
at one point, I was like, they were trying to call a chair, and I said, hey, look, I can do it. I administer all day and twice on Sunday, right?
Mm-hmm.
Administration is not a problem. The question is, should I? Like, in some sense, as the white guy, I feel like my position here is to sit back and listen first.
Mm-hmm.
And one of there's several clergy on this group, right? And one of the black pastors is like, I really like that you said that. Right? Like, you're not here to tell me what I'm seeing is not what I'm seeing. I'm like, well, yeah,
Mm-hmm.
why would I do that, right?
Yeah, no, that's good. That's I think that's interesting. That hats off to them for putting it together. But I think that's a smart thing. Is that you talked about your own needing to learn and outside of the church be able to grow. But I think that's evidence of that growth and why that method works. Is that if you're doing the personal work as a leader, as someone who's a leader in faith, you recognize, well, I'm in the room, but I don't need to lead this room.
Well,
This is
well,
nothing
no,
that I need to be sitting in front of.
100%, right? And it's not about my ego to be there, right? Like, hey, look,
Mm-hmm.
I helped reconsider police policy. Actually, no, I'm probably there to rubber stamp it as a white guy, which is okay.
Right. Sadly.
Um, but I also don't go there to have my name in a history book, which I
Yeah,
really
that's a big
find it
one.
really striking about white folk who start to engage anti-racism work often do have a desire for legacy.
Right.
Uh, and I struggle with that because I think, in the church, like you said earlier, there are fundamental conceptions within the Christian tradition that white Christianity is just bastardized.
Mm-hmm.
And one of those is humility, right? Like, I actually don't know everything that's going on.
Mm-hmm.
I don't have the perfect view from nowhere. Um, so, again, I think it's amazing that we can start to reclaim certain key virtues
Right.
within the Christian tradition to help us engage that work.
Well, yeah, and humility, and it's spot on, right? Like the idea that if we're going to do this work, we have to admit that we don't know something.
Oh, yeah.
But that's also one of the biggest tenets of faith, isn't it? You don't know everything, but you have the faith that you're being guided in the right direction.
And then come back and say the discernment to recognize when you're being led in the
In
opposite
the wrong.
direction.
Right.
Right?
Exactly.
Like,
Yeah.
the scriptures and the tradition are full of conversations about discernment of spirits. What is it that's happening here?
Mm-hmm.
And in the tradition, especially, sorry, now you're getting my PhD work.
Hey, that's fine.
In the in the monastic tradition, you can't discern the spirits by yourself.
Right.
Right? Like, you actually have to engage in that work with someone else. And say, and again, comes back to that, like we said earlier, submitting to um, persons of color. For me, is to say, okay,
Mm-hmm.
I'm not seeing something, aren't I? Like, I'm missing something here, aren't I?
Yeah. anything that I've missed, anything that you want to say about racism and Christianity, or those who are working to better things? What did I miss?
Oh, I think, and you might know that, I mean, see it too, even outside the church, that there's also a generational struggle
Mm-hmm.
around the conversation of race. And I think that generational struggle is happening both in the white church and the black church. Right.
Agreed. Agreed.
Um, Brenda Salter McNeil opens her book Becoming Brave about being in St. Louis after in Ferguson.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, the kind of youth leadership of the nascent Black Lives Matter movement at that point is like, we're going down, they call, and they're like calling these older pastors, right? I mean, Dr. McNeil's just a little bit older than us. And they're like, hey, we're going to City Hall. Are you coming with us? And all of a
Right.
sudden they were like, because they're like, if you ain't coming, we're leaving now.
Right.
Right. That there is this tension. And I heard it too on another trip where a woman who was in Birmingham in the Children's Crusade, kind of talked disparagingly about Black Lives Matter. I don't think she meant to do it, but she didn't feel like it connected to her experience of the civil rights movement.
Mm-hmm.
So there is this generational divide that's happening. And I think in terms of the white church, that's similar, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
I do have this friend that she's an old plain dress minister in Virginia, and she's the last thing that she would call herself is a progressive. But when George Floyd was killed, she was like, I thought we got past this. And I was like, wow, you really are a progressive. That noticeable generational difference. There's something of coming out
Mm-hmm.
of 64, 65. I mean, even a little bit later, and 20, 12, go to Trayvon to
Mm-hmm.
there's something qualitatively different in the generational experiences of this. That's a part I don't have my finger on the pulse, but I recognize
Well,
it
you,
and see it.
it's funny. Here, there's a changing of the guard happening with our NAACP, and the incoming president is, if he's 26, I'll give you $30. Like, I don't think he's even that old,
Uh-huh.
right? Like, super young. But the outgoing president is, he may have retired, like, from work. He's that old,
Mm-hmm.
and there's this humongous gap where the incoming wants to do all these things that are very much different. And I was having this conversation. I was like, well, but you have to understand, for the older generation, their job was just to stand up.
Yeah.
Like, for them, showing up and making change was literally physically just showing up. Like, that was the call. King said, if we're going to march and we're going to do this, let's show up on Wallace's doorstep and show him what we're about. Well, yeah, that was great 50 years ago. We've moved beyond just showing up. And so now it's this new movement of, we need more action. We need to show up, but we also need to change laws. We also need to make sure that we're in the rooms where the laws are being made. Like, there's so much more that this younger generation is willing to do. Not that the older generation wasn't willing to do it, but they couldn't imagine it, right? Like, there's no way in the world in 64 and 65 you're going to say, hey, let's go to all the major corporations and figure out how we become board members so that we can make sure that their practices aren't racist. That wouldn't happen 50, 60 years ago. Today, that can happen.
That can happen.
And I think that's the difference, is just the work that was done then worked. It opened doors. It made change. But for that older generation that still has their hands on the wheel, they don't realize you need to let go. Like, you've done your job. Thank you for your service. Now let the next generation move us to the next step forward.
Yeah. That's, you're talking about cycles again. I mean, that's not any
Mm-hmm.
different from the NAACP in 1953 and, coming out of Brown versus Board, right?
Right.
Like, that was a major victory from the NAACP's strategy to
Mm-hmm.
then have the Montgomery Improvement Association come along with this like radical idea of civil disobedience as a means.
Right.
to then having, I mean, you literally have 3 generations at that point, right? Then you have SNCC come out of the sit-ins, and you have 3 generations trying to figure out how to do the same thing. And they didn't get along then either.
Right. Exactly. Exactly.
You have the SCLC, SNCC, and the NAACP just kind of like picking back and forth at each other. I mean, this is
Right.
Stokely Carmichael's strong rebuke of King and the nonviolence movement.
Right. Right.
And I think that's happening again, right? I think you're 100% right. That's happening again.
Man, I think when you look at the Black Panther Party and all of those things that happened in the 70s, and I think that there was a severe drop off giving MOVE bombings and the jailing of UEP Newton and his assassination. And there was a fear of, all right, we've gotten so far, they're literally finding new ways to kill us. And so I think that, things lay dormant. I think there was a lot of work that was done, but it wasn't sort of the public facing, continuously aggregating things that are happening. And I think this new generation is willing to do that, but they're doing it in a way that's so radical, it's really upsetting those that came before us. But you're right. It's the same thing that was happening, 50 through 70, multiple generations of people working towards the same cause, but just doing it radically different. So
yeah, and I think it starts to show too. This goes back to your culture question, right? Is what the kind of egalitarian approach of the early Black Lives Matter, and also then naming intersectionality as a part of the realities of race, whether starting to name the impact of race intersecting with gender and sexuality. Ruffles a lot of feathers, right?
Yeah.
And it's good. It's fundamentally good. I mean, I was saying about this person that I attended her ordination, right? She's the first woman in her congregation to be ordained.
Oh my Lord.
2021, and she's
100 years after suffrage.
Yeah. And her perseverance there is fantastic. And the allies she had in the congregation that kind of worked at that for her to make it happen are astounding. But let's go ahead and name, there are some struggles there, right? Gender does intersect there differently.
Right.
So there's a lot of work to be done, and it's okay to have those cultural incursions that help shed some light on some assumptions that we made along the way.
Right.
Hey, sometime I'll have to tell you about the research I did on Selma.
Oh yeah, we will have to have that talk.
Yeah, we'll do that. We'll do that because I think it starts to get at some of this too of how does the white church engage the larger movements for civil rights, maintaining those civil rights.
Well, we will definitely have to do that on a future episode. So
yep, let's do it.
All right, man. Thank you so much for your time. This has been amazing. So, Josh Brockway, if folks wanted to get a hold of you, are you up for that or not?
Yeah, sure. Go ahead. J Brockway at brethren.org. So that's BRETHREN.org.
All right. And I'll drop that in the show notes as well. So, Josh, thank you for your time. And there goes my voice. Have an amazing day.
Yeah, thanks, dude. Appreciate it.
Thank you for listening to Systemic. This podcast aims to create a community of change and can only do so through your support. Please make sure you subscribe and follow wherever you listen to podcasts. And if you would, head over to Apple Podcasts to rate and leave a review. The more you share and review Systemic, the more our community of change can grow. Another way you can help is supporting Systemic on Patreon. Your contributions will allow the podcast to expand and give you the opportunity to support Systemic offline. Thank you again for listening and your support. Systemic is a production and passion of Park Multimedia. And remember, to solve any problem, you must first acknowledge it exists.